Good afternoon, viewers. In case you haven't been following, the Canadian government just dumped its tax on digital services in Canada. And it's important probably to understand what this may or may not mean to Canadians in general. I should start off with the Canadian government's news release of June 29, 2025, Department of Finance. Now, obviously, it looks bad when Trump says we're not going to carry on any negotiations whatsoever unless you drop this tax. Canada drops the tax, and it looks like we've capitulated. So, how does Canada put a spin on this capitulation? Well, you'll like this. It says Canada's new government is engaged in complex negotiations on a new economic and security partnership with the United States, focused on getting the best deal for Canadian workers and businesses. Prime Minister Carney has been clear that Canada will take as long as necessary, but no longer to achieve that goal. The hell does that mean?
I
You know,
have no
you know,
idea.
it no longer the necessary. It wouldn't be necessary if Trump hadn't put the taxes on. How do we have any control over this, anyways? Right?
That tax would generate $2 billion in ongoing income to the federal government. So by walking away from that tax, which was planned, what, a couple of years ago, that they planned to implement 3 years ago, how does that speak volumes to Trump winning? Like, Trump is a lunatic. He's going to run around, I won. See, I saved you billions of dollars to all these large companies. It's going to get worse, and it's going to impact Europe. Europe is putting in the same tax, and now many of the countries in Europe are going, Jesus, now that you give Trump a minor victory of saving billionaires billions of dollars, the wealthy corporations and multi-internationals are going to use Trump to extort taxes due as a means of negotiation for tariffs. This is not good. This is bad.
The point we have to get past first is everybody kind of agrees it's bad. It's bad because you don't collect the money. It's bad because the money leaves the country tax free. It's bad because anything is bad for negotiations when you cave prior to the negotiations. So the government has spin doctors, and they go on to say to support these negotiations, the Minister of Finance and National Revenue, the Honorable blah blah Champlain, and now say that Canada would rescind the digital service tax in anticipation of mutually beneficial comprehensive trade agreements with the United States. Consistent with this action, Prime Minister Carney and President Trump have agreed that all parties will resume negotiations with a view towards agreeing on a deal by July 21, 2025. So Carney gave up this tax in order to start negotiations again, believing or anticipating that it would be mutually beneficial. Now,
You're
has
dealing with a guy that you can't trust. I mean, Trump was notoriously against the protection of the, what do they call, supply management for the agriculture industry, specifically for dairy products. And now that Carney backed down on a major issue, is he going to back down on dairy lobbying by Trump? Trump's going to be trying to get this. While Canada Dairy Lobby welcomed the C-202 passage, some agricultural industry leaders argue that it stifles their industries in favor of bolstering dairy and gives the country very little wiggle room should Trump come knocking for more concessions. Kircher says, I think Carney government is now getting into a position where the rubber is really going to hit the road. If you've given it in on the digital tax, is that a concession that Mr. Trump will see as a concession and accept, or will Trump continue to push Canada and say, well, now, what about supply management? And I'm leaning to the conclusion that a bully like Trump, you just gave him fuel to push and push and push to get his supply management concessions. And that's not good, because that impacts the dairy industry significantly and farmers.
Well, to begin with, there's a fallacy that Trump negotiates anything that's mutually beneficial.
No,
Anything
man,
that
never.
and anything he negotiates, he believes he has to win. He has to be the winner of that. So
Yeah.
that, that's a mistake to begin with. Now that the next thing is that the reason this tax, digital services tax, was announced in 2020.
Exactly.
So it's been in the works for a long time, and it's to address the fact that many large technological companies operating in Canada may not otherwise pay tax on revenues generated in Canada. So they know that the money is going south.
Is that money counted as the differential on the deficit to trade between the
Of
two
course not.
countries?
Of
Exactly.
course not. Yeah, and the other thing is too, Canada's not alone in this.
Right.
Other countries around the world are also doing the same thing. It comes down to a matter of fairness. There isn't any.
Well,
When it
how
comes
much
when it,
does the technology industry make in Canada? My estimate's probably 70 billion annually.
what I did is I worked backwards from 3% and calculated that they must have based the $3 billion on almost $70 billion in revenue. Of course, we don't have the exact numbers of what it is.
Well, isn't oil about 160 billion annual income to Canada?
Yeah, it's 18% of Canadians' exports. So
Right.
this would be a good percentage of Canadian exports
8
in
or
tax
9%.
in lost tax revenue. And
Yeah.
so you have to look at that and go, okay, when you're looking at a balance of trade between countries, it would be useful to be fair in what you're actually measuring. And of course, there is nothing fair in what Trump measures ever. Just ask Stormy Daniels.
Well, this this technological money leaving the country, it leaves the local economies for good. It's not coming back. There's no trickle down economics applied to technology ad revenues leaving the country. That's gone for good. So why can't we collect taxes on it? You know, that
well, and
Europe was looking at a 3% tax the same way, and now the EU wants also to put a 15% locked in tax for multi-internationals doing business in other countries, because a lot of these businesses go to tax havens, conduct business via the internet, do a lot of trade with these countries, and then ends up paying no countries to the where they're doing business, and that hurts the economy of those countries. Basically, by Trump pushing that he's not going to negotiate anything on the tariffs, he wants free access to international markets. He wants those businesses and his social media outlet to have free access to Canadian markets. That's why there's a conflict of interest, because Trump also owns a media outlet which makes money from these MAGA supporters in Canada. And that is very wrong. I mean, we have laws of conflict of interest laws here. Now, is Carney aiding and abetting conflict of interest laws with Trump by dropping this tax? I say yes. He should never have dropped it. It was implemented for a reason, and that reason is that these technology revenues are taking away from local economies where journalism and media outlets are losing in a battle to misrepresentation, lies, no censorship, no rules, no regulations. And a lot of our media now is foreign owned. We're basically, CBC is the only one standing. And this is loss of revenue in the technology industry that is causing misinformation to be the primary marketing tool to raise revenues. So we got major problems with this, and I think taxation is one of the ways we start reining in these exploitive and gaslighting techniques used in technology to line their pockets.
I think though there's another side to this. If you think about it, the revenue was not there to begin with. In other words, Carney has given up something that was expected, but was never, never materialized in the past. So as a bargaining chip, he's really not given up anything that he had already. He gave up something that he was expecting to have. And
Well,
let's look at this. If you put
okay.
$3 billion into perspective, that we're going to spend $4.5 billion on French language specialties, over the next few years. I mean, maybe we should cut that out, and that would help balance whatever the tax burden is. But you're looking at another end game that is probably more subtle because Carney, you remember, is an international banker, head of Bank of Canada and Bank of England. He's the
Yes.
only foreigner that's ever been in charge of the Bank of England. In the month of April, Canadian investors bought over $9 billion in U.S. government bonds, which is the largest investment since November 2023. In addition, they purchased 1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bills this last month. And
Sure.
one has to wonder why Canadians or Canadian institutions buying U.S. debt when the U.S. has a war on Canada for trade. It seems counterintuitive. Why are we supporting their debt when their debt load is partially responsible by their
Well,
spending
is that
habits?
institutional purchases?
Well,
I suggest it's large businesses doing the purchase, and some of those might be subsidiaries of U.S. corporations doing the purchase to hedge their bets against the tariffs that they know they're going to be caught in, even though their head office is in the U.S.
it could be more subtle than that. Yeah, the Canadian banks have huge leverage, and quite possibly by buying U.S. government treasury bonds, the government in the U.S. is under pressure to raise the interest rate because nobody wants them at the current, interest rate that's below 5%,
Yeah.
which means that once they increase the percentage rate, the return on the treasury bonds, their payments on debt is going to increase. And they're saying that it may actually match their spending on the military, which means that they either have to print more money or tax somebody, tax their own
Well,
billionaires.
When Carney took leadership of the Liberal Party, he implemented a purchase program through the federal government. I don't know how many billions, but he bought U.S. bonds and stuff so that he had leverage over the U.S. government. The same as Japan uses that leverage to negotiate, because if they dump those back onto the market, they'll sink the U.S. economy because they can't cover the debt.
Same with China. China is one of the biggest. Yeah. So here's the thing: does America renege on its debt, or does it have to, raise the interest rate in order to cover the past
Trump,
debt?
he walks away from all debt.
Yeah. Well, he's been bankrupt 13 times, but never gone
He's
broke.
an expert. Yeah, he's an expert at walking away from money owed.
So maybe that's the plan. America goes bankrupt and starts all over again with no debt, but it would also start with no friends. That's not going to work well for them. So here's the thing: maybe there's something in the background that's larger than the news, and maybe giving up something that we didn't have in the first place isn't as serious as it initially sounds.
Well, we joined that coalition with the EU, and the EU has plans to implement 15% locked taxes on multi-internationals doing business in other countries. And with 28 nations being party and 29 if Canada, maybe Australia and a few others join, they put a big dent into the program, and that more than compensates for the 3% tax that he just gave up. And if that's their plan to block this free business of multi-internationals in various countries without having to pay taxes on it. Like a document here that I read was the European Commission forecasts that 3% tax on revenues from digital advertising and services provided by online marketplace and intermediates within the EU 28 member countries could yield approximately 4.7 billion euro annually for member states. So if they put a 15% tax, we multiply that number by 5 times that number, so we're talking close to 25 billion euro income, which might be what Carney is leaning towards, feeling that a 28 country or 30 country coalition will force this 15% tax, and Canada will benefit a lot better than trying to push the 3% tax alone.
If you look at the other side of this coin here, if you give the tyrant what he wanted, which it really is, you've just given them nothing you had in the first place. Exports in manufactured goods to the US is 354 billion, which is a substantially larger number. If you need to protect that industry at the expense of foregoing a digital services tax, it makes sense to do that.
Yeah, but it makes no sense because Trump's screwed in the head. He thinks tariffs is how he's going to make sure that his wealthy partners and buddies never pay taxes again in the U.S. So the wealthy won't pay taxes, and that he's going to burden the taxpayers in the U.S. with these tariffs to pay, and that isn't going to change. You can't negotiate with a lunatic that has the idea he's going to get these tariffs to lower his personal tax commitments and that of his buddies that financed him to get into power. So, I mean, look at Musk. Musk isn't going to argue with Trump over not paying taxes out of Canada. He just saved them 3% tax that he would have had to pay for business through X. Not to mention Starlink and other businesses that capitalize on revenues from Canada and they pay no money. I mean, that brings me up to a question. In the news, Trump has just posted on his social site that he is looking into claiming that Musk is not a U.S. citizen because he lied on a citizen application. And as a result, Trump is investigating if he can deport Trump or Musk. So Musk is in a position where he is a Canadian citizen and a citizen of South Africa. But he probably used his Canadian citizenship to get preferential treatment to get a U.S. citizenship at the time. Now, does that mean that Canada should seek a whole bunch of back taxes owed by this Canadian citizen illegally in the U.S., if so ruled by Trump? I say yes. He lied to get his U.S. citizenship application. Now, the implications of that is that Musk paid no federal income tax in 2018 in the U.S. Between 2014 and 2018, his wealth grew by $13.9 billion, yet he paid only $455 million in federal income tax at a rate of only 3.2% for that period of time. So the wealthy are not paying the same in taxes as you or I on money earned. That's not fair. And how are they doing that? One of the methods is they pay themselves in share dividends to be taxed at a lesser rate. And when they sell the shares are taxed at a lesser rate. So it goes to show you when you have a monetary backed political system where the rich pay for the politicians to get elected, it affects the laws. The laws favor the wealthy. And they get more benefits than you and I because they pay less taxes. That's not right. That's not fair, but they hoard their wealth. And I remember you had some comments on what people were paying in Ontario for taxes.
Yeah, so obviously there's less tax on money than there is on labor. If we can go back to the government's reasons and rationale with respect to canceling the goods and digital services tax,
Right.
one of the offices of many that they have in Ottawa, and I don't know if it's the same from the time I visited that place, is they actually have somebody that writes press releases, a war room, so to speak, where they read the news and they put out press releases. And then they provide quotes for the bigwigs to sign. The one that they've given to Carney says, in our negotiations on a new economic and security relationship between Canada and the United States, that's how the sentence begins. It adds the word security relationship. And if you remember, the Americans are talking about this golden dome or golden mushroom or whatever the hell Trump's going
Yeah.
to call this thing, the big, beautiful dome to protect Americans from ballistic missiles. Now, back in the past, we had the DEW line, and the DEW
Yeah.
line was a series of radar stations across northern Canada that were supposed to detect Russian bombers coming over the horizon. In the mid 1980s, it was replaced due to advancements in technology. It's now called the North Warning System. and the Americans want to bring in a system of early warning. Guess where it will be? It will be on Canadian soil.
Yeah.
So when they say new economic and security relationships, I hope they're talking about getting something for having American boots on the ground in Canada in order to protect American cities from wherever they think these problems are going to
Well,
originate.
I think Trudeau actually dealt with that. He signed a deal with Australia for over their Horizon technologies, which is satellite technology that is more advanced than what the U.S. firms have. And that was $1 billion commitment, and there might probably will be a bit more. But the problem with Canada is we're on the missile path for anybody like Russia or China targeting the U.S. All the missiles come right over Canada. And the early detection systems means that the U.S. is going to fire countermeasures, and guess where all the missiles are going to be exploded right above us. So that's
Okay.
unfortunate for Canada, but great for the U.S. because they get to shoot down the missiles long before they get to U.S. territory.
Do you
Now,
believe for a moment that the Americans are going to allow a foreign system to be programmed into their overall command?
well,
There's
that's
not a
part of
chance. So,
NORAD,
so,
and
so
NATO,
whatever,
but
whatever Canada
Alaska.
spent on this was a waste of money if they think they're going to integrate that into a
Well,
U.S.
they don't want
shield.
to integrate it. It's to protect Canada's north. So it's more of a Canadian incentive to break the ties with NORAD and NATO for the protection of the north. And it means we're seeking sovereignty in the north. Now,
Nobody's bombing the North.
Trump's dome for can be operated out of Alaska just as good as anywhere. So we don't really have to comply with Trump on his dome dreams. And back to the tax issue is more important is what is the average rate of tax that income paid over $250,000 in Canada?
Well, it's a percentage of half. So you're it's much lower than if it was a earned by a wage. So when you
Right.
make money for doing nothing but having your money make money, your tax is a lot less than if you make money by getting out every day and doing your labor.
So
But it's
the average person in Canada, the majority of us, we work with our hands and our time and our labor, and we have to pay more money than a guy that can sit and manipulate money without ever having to get his hands dirty or do anything. And he has money managers working for him that do all the manipulation. So the wealthy have bought their way into paying less taxes, gaslighting us that it's a fair system. And here we are talking about, Musk getting 3 point whatever percent tax rate. Sure, he's a Canadian citizen, but he operating businesses here and pays nothing for the revenue he generates here on X and wherever. And we're having to pay these high taxes. Whatever happened to the 1950s and where corporate taxes were more than personal tax?
they all threaten to leave. But here's another thought: the value of stocks traded in Canada, as expressed in U.S. dollars in 2022, was $2.2 trillion dollars.
Yes.
Now, if you go to your local grocery store and buy pretty much anything, like your 7-Eleven or Max Milk or whatever the hell they have anymore, you're going to pay goods and services tax or PST or whatever you want to call it on top of everything that you buy, whether it's a car or anything.
Right.
But you buy shares, and you can buy and sell those shares as many times as you want and never pay tax on them. And you
Yeah.
were alluding to the fact that when you take your income in shares, you pay substantially less tax. But
Oh,
when
for
you
sure.
buy your shares, you pay no tax.
Yep.
So and it's an actual transaction. Now, why don't we have a tax on the purchase of shares
Well,
like
I
we have a
agree with you
tax?
that there should be a tax. That's one implementation that a fair and equitable democratic government would do to ensure that the wealthy aren't ripping off the average person on fair share contributions to federal income tax. the
Well,
issue, the issue with the stock market is very complex, and just grazing over the surface is all we're doing now. We'll have to do another take of in-depth talk of the
I
corruption
think
of the stock market.
the answer is tied to the Digital Services Tax. If there was a tax on the purchase of shares in Canada, people would just log on to the stock exchange in New York and buy and sell their shares in New York, totally bypassing the Canadian markets altogether. So the
Yes,
Canadian
but then
markets
there's a
would,
foreign investment option as well. I mean, there are other issues that the wealth of the U.S. is manipulating international markets, which is what that your union, the EU union, is trying to say. We're going to stop with a 15% business tax on money generated out of our countries. And that would go to stock purchases off the New York Stock Exchange, etc. So that this would be one of the avenues of collecting the tax if you're making money off of money from your country, right?
yeah, but how would you track that? So I get on the internet and I put my VPN on so that I look like I'm coming out of anywhere in the world. And I dipped into my cryptocurrency and I buy IBM shares in New York.
Well, the key
Or
word was cryptocurrency. That's how you hide black money. That's
well,
why it
even
was criminal to even allow cryptocurrency as a monetary exchange that's untraceable. That's why
and there's no
Trump set up his own cryptocurrency. You can never trace it. As much as you say, oh, well, they got on the stock market, you can show where the cash was cashed out. Yeah, but you can't tell what they paid for it. You can't tell where it was generated. And when it's issued, when you're the issuer of it and you make the cryptocurrency, 80% of it stays in your pocket. You only put 20% out for the dupes to buy to push your net wealth up astronomically. And that's the scam. And it's nothing but a Ponzi scheme scam that should never have been allowed. But the Securities Commission wanted to get their fingers on it. So they legitimized it by setting up to have trading in it. And that's wrong. You know,
well, if I
that
buy
is criminal by nature.
if I buy cryptocurrency, why am I not paying a tax on that purchase? I'm I'm
Yeah,
I'm buying something which is a digital service that
yeah.
hasn't got anything to do with the big U.S. tech companies, and it's actually a purchase. And the way to probably control that more closely is put a tax on it. That way you can follow the
Yeah, but
money.
it's an underground. Yeah, but it's an underground market. So if you tax it, they're just going to shove it further underground, so you can't trace any transactions. The Securities Commission was saying, well, it's an underground market. We'll just try to. It's very lucrative underground market. It's borderline illegal. So we'll just try to collect money off it by opening up it to be legal on the stock exchange. So they're complicit with dirty money laundering. That's bottom line. You can move money across international borders with cryptocurrency. One of the greatest scams of all history was cryptocurrency, and I'm pretty sure it was designed by some crime boss that was smarter than smart, and I'm surprised he hasn't come out and claimed, you know, how rich he is. I mean, whoever set up Bitcoin has 80% of the coins in his pocket, and that means he's worth trillions, but quietly it doesn't matter. So I really have a problem with stock markets and the wealthy hiding fraud and scams as part of legitimate business. And that even goes to the valuation structure of having air being worth so much money on the stock market. But me as a private business, I can only get what my asset values are and what maybe a year or two of business is the value of my company. That's wrong. And therein lies a whole subject we can discuss on the stock market, because we can get pretty in depth on it. I mean, we're just skimming the surface on this one. But we better get back to, we were wanting to talk more about taxes and this digital tax system that Canada walked away from.
Again, in the scheme of things, it sounds like a large number, but when you look at what Canada is wasting on, other projects that are
Totally.
large numbers.
Yeah.
It really isn't giving up all that much. And if it makes the tyrant happy because his billionaire friends that helped him get elected are now breathing a sigh of relief that their investment in Trump is starting to pay off, so be it. And the next question is, does it inflate that man's ego to the point where he becomes intolerable and you can't make a deal with him anyways? Or
Well, Truth
does
Social
it
just
give
made
does
money. He didn't have to fork out money for Truth Social. He's got quite a bit of big following here in Alberta. There's lots of MAGA hat wearers in Alberta that are on Truth Social and hand him money and probably buy his merchandise and scams and whatever. So he would have owed a lot of money to Canada just off his Truth Social, and we know that company is already in debt up to its eyeballs, hasn't made any money other than lining Trump's pockets as he skims off the top. That's a feather in his cap, but as a bully and a very poor businessman at that, he's going to take this as a major victory, and he is not going to knuckle down to anything that Carney's going to deal with. You never give a tidbit to a moron in a negotiation before you've actually negotiated. That's not going to bode well for Canada. We're going to get nailed with big tariffs and the tariff of the trade agreements we already have. It's all about
well,
Trump saving on tax dollars.
we'll have to see how the psychology works out, though, because sometimes a psychopath like Trump, you give him a victory and he's out there doing the victory dance, and before he knows it, he signed another trade deal that he's going to object to next year, just like the one he negotiated before.
Yeah,
When he stands up and he says, "I don't know who negotiated this horrible deal," and
it was
you
him.
go look at the signature, yeah, yeah, look at the signature on the bottom, it's you.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
but what he's really saying is when I negotiate a deal, I go with it until I don't like it anymore, and then I negotiate another one that I'm
yeah.
not probably going to
I,
like. It can't be trusted. We left off before we had our technical glitch with respect to the government press releases. The government has a press secretary, and he has probably the nicest office outside of the Parliament buildings, overlooking the House, and
right.
nice big corner office. And in that office, they have a number of news machines that get news from all around the world, and they have a whole team of people there that decide what is or what is not news. They then take their news press releases and they put them in slots, or at least they used to, at the front door. So prior to getting access to the building, you have access to all the press releases, most of which are pretty routine, like, blessing Mary for the loss of her puppy and, that kind of stuff. But some of them are critically important. And based on the size of this announcement where you're foregoing your digital tax, you would think it
Right.
would be a very extensive press release. But they do include two quotes. The quotes for Carney's, I read part of that with respect to the new economic and security relationship. And it says Canada's new government will always be guided by the overall contribution of any possible agreement to the best interests of Canadian workers and businesses. Today's announcement will support the resumption of negotiations towards the July 21, 2025 timeline set out at this month's G7 Leaders Summit in Kananaskis. Now, the finance minister says, and you'll get a kick out of this, Canada's new government. So they in this press release, they're distancing themselves from the prior government of Trudeau. So they're
Right.
saying Canada's new government is focused on building the strongest economy in the G7 and standing up for Canadian workers and businesses. Rescinding the Digital Services Tax will allow the negotiations of a new economic and security relationship with the United States to make vital progress and reinforce our work to create jobs and build prosperity for all Canadians. Now, again, he brings up security relationship. So they're not only talking about economic here, they're talking about security. Now, of course, a good economic relationship gives both countries security. But I think they're dropping the big hint on Trump that he's not going to get what he wants for Canada's contribution to his Golden Dome unless
Well, that was
he
never
comes.
going to happen anyway. But with the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick shared a statement on social media on Monday morning praising Canada's decision to scrap the tax. He said, "Thank you,
Yeah.
Canada, for removing our digital services tax, which was intended to stifle American innovation and would have been a deal breaker for any trade deal with America," he wrote on X. How does that stifle American innovation by lining their pockets with our money? It doesn't.
People may have, it's not that much when you put it in perspective, but people
But 70
may have,
billion is a lot of money that goes to,
yes, and that should be included in the balance of trade calculations, but the actual tax itself,
then we
which
would be in a deficit position if they added that to the trade deficit. Canada would be getting less than the US from our free trade agreement. So that's probably a reality Canadians should wake up. We're getting screwed by Americans left, right, and center. Maybe quiet quitting is the option, and I'm sure Carney's already doing that with the deals with Europe. So there are some logic to his strategies. I just don't have inside ears to what his rationale would be for this. I see it as a big blunder on his part, but we'll see.
The other issue, when I can get back to the security issue, people have probably forgotten the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. Remember remember under President Reagan, 1983, they brought in this Star Wars scenario where they were going to protect the U.S. from ballistic missiles from outer space. That collapsed. So the new one, the Golden Dome, probably has about the same chance of success as Star Wars had. And Reagan, in his whoever does his franchising for him in those days, naming it after a popular movie was probably good marketing. And of course, Trump is going to come up with some marketing scam to make it sound like, this is good investments. But they're going to need Canada. They're going to need Canada.
Wasn't the Golden Dome or something out of one of the James Bond's movies? They had some golden missiles in space or some stupid thing. I forget what it was, but my memory's not that good on James Bond movies. But have to ask one of the podcast comedy hosts.
It was called Goldeye. It was called Goldeye.
Yeah, and they had all these satellites ready to take out everything coming into the U.S. and Europe, and somebody hacked into it and got it so they could use it as a weapon against them. But yeah,
they need Canada, and
that's a fantasy Trump lives in, right? He lives in a fantasy world of lies, and he believes everybody's as stupid as he is.
He's a master marketer.
I'll give him that. The only thing that guy is really good at, and he's exceptional, is lies, deceit, to market, to line his pockets. And that's what a capitalist is. He's a true capitalist. He has no desire other than to capitalize on your stupidity to line his pockets. And that's what capitalism is. And don't ever forget that we're against everything else, socialism, blah, 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 blah. That's all rhetoric from a capitalist. And capitalists only want to be the king of the pile, and the rest of you are peons. And that's their mentality. That's a capitalist. I am not a capitalist. Never will be. I think I ranted again. But okay, so what else we got to cover on that?
It's hard to be a capitalist without any capital.
That's true too. I've been ripped off enough to know that's, the capitalists ripped me off, but hey, whatever. But we know we're not good at movie reviews, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, so maybe
those come to us for movie reviews.
Maybe the comics can get onto that.
There you go. So now that
how are they doing? I haven't heard from them for a while.
Yeah, they're it's summertime, they're busy, but they'll be doing more podcasts. Hopefully.
Busy what? Drinking beer?
No, they're planning and working and all that good stuff. I'll end up, getting backlash for that. We might have to be the new comics, because it's totally hilarious how everybody's getting ripped off, and they back of the trough thinking they're getting gold for their gravel. It's not reality. We're getting screwed, and we're getting screwed more and more. And the capitalists did it on a long-term strategy back from Reaganomics, and it's been a slow whittling down of the social values that protected the average person. It didn't happen overnight. We see now the capitulation of a slow long-term bleed on politics. And Trump and his billionaires have taken over the economies of the world, and now we have to move cautiously if we want to preserve social structures, because capitalism is all about we are the slaves and they get all the rewards.
It's not new. Like you're forgetting about Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller,
Oh
Cornelius
yeah,
Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, who
they've
made
had to
vast
fight.
fortunes. But the Trump regime is the latest. They've now negotiated a peace settlement in Africa that includes Nigeria giving up its minerals. I guess they're not depending on Ukrainian minerals so much anymore.
Well,
You know,
they watched Russia run in, and last week Russia run in and took the largest lithium deposit in Ukraine. So Trump obviously had a deal with Russia. Oh, I'll get oil mineral rights off of you, and I'll get mineral rights off Ukraine. So I don't care which side wins. I'm not giving weapons to either one because I win-win. So I'd like to see the backdoor deals he's got with Putin, because Putin sure pulls his strings. So it's got to be money on the table. But anyway, that's another issue. Is that all we're going to cover on this session?
we haven't beaten it to death.
I think we always do. And then I get to edit it up a bit. Try to make us look better than we are.
Well, have a happy Canada Day.
Yeah, happy Canada Day. Hey, it's the
Yeah.
60th year of the maple leaf on our flag, which we should be proud of, because Trump wants to burn the flag and take us over and make us the 51st state. Keep your head high, elbows high, and be ready to body check anybody standing in your way, folks.
Well, one of the reasons you like
Good
the
old
flag is
hockey
because
game.
the Liberals designed it.
Well, I
That's
don't
why.
know who designed it.
Oh, come on. Yeah. Who
What,
was
you
in
saying
power
I'm a
60 years ago?
liberal? You saying I'm a liberal supporter? No, I only support those with intellectual prowess, with a solid game that isn't going to destroy us. And that's it. I don't care who you are. You could be tuck for all I care. And I resent you saying I'm a liberal supporter. Carney's done some smart moves. He's allowed to do one or two dumb ones. As long as the end outcome is positive for Canada, I'll support it until otherwise shown that he's not good for Canada.
Well, we'll have to see how this one works out. It's
Yeah,
going
it's
to all
interesting, but thanks for
July
the
21st.
informative information. I mean, we did cover a lot. I can hardly wait till we cover the one on the stock market. That one, I think we're going to present some pretty eye-opening information for our viewers.
Well, it's kind of like a. Well, I won't get into it. Have a good
Okay,
day.
well,
Have a
the
good
bag,
rest
the
of
bag
Canada.
lady, the
Goodbye.
bag lady's getting her information ready on the insurance industry. She doesn't want to be
Perfect.
identified, and that should be
Oh,
another one that's interesting
for
coming up.
for the benefit of our viewers, there's certain guests that worry about being identified due to the fact that they belong to certain organizations that could wreak havoc on their career. So we've got scheduled this lady that's going to give us some insight into the insurance industry, and she's agreed to design a bag so so she can
We'll call her
appear.
our bag lady,
Yeah,
bag
and
full of wealth of information.
and we came up with, originally we were going to have some political commentary, and there's a bunch of bagmen out there that again, had
Exactly.
insight to a lot
Yeah.
of things that were going on in the last election, but didn't want to be identified because it would ruin their chances of working in the next one. But they unfortunately didn't even want to appear with a bag on their head because they're
Well,
afraid
it's
somebody would
scary
look at it.
because, you know, like the wealthy have the power to ruin your life. And it's a reality. And a lot of our comments that we comment about are based on a lot of knowledge that we've acquired over the years talking to people who have been affected directly or indirectly by the topics we're covering. So you and I are not trying to make uninformed decisions and comments to the viewers. We're trying to say, hey, maybe there's more to the story. And, you know, if you comment, we might be able to answer some of your questions that we failed to cover in this video if you make comments. And we're more than willing to try to answer questions. Or if you have information or a story that you feel could benefit from us discussing it with you, we would love to hear from you. We like to take information and present it, but we don't want to endanger your well-being, so you may very well be another bag person. So on that
Cal
note,
Greedy, Cal Greedy too.
that's right.
Or would that be Cal Greedy as well? Anyways,
Exactly. Okay, so we'll
goodbye.
go on that note. Happy Canada Day. And to all you Americans, happy Canada Day. Maybe you'll be the
Yeah.
another
We'll cut off
province
your
of
cheese.
Canada. Yeah. Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and please share the video. Don't be afraid to share this commercial with your friends too.